kia ora everyone. I'll try and get, are you seeing my screen? Okay, great. So I'm showing a natural regeneration here today. So I also, grew up in Upper Moutere on a family farm, mixed sheep and beef. We also have forestry in Upper Moutere and also in the Motueka catchment. So this particular talk, I'm going to be talking about a place in the Marlborough Sounds. So this is a special place called Ornatea. It's in Cressel's Harbour on the very western side of the Marlborough Sounds, near Old Bay. Some of you might know where that is. And my family bought it in the early 80s. And it's a really cool place. The very northern part of the Mount Richmond Forest Park comes up in the upper catchment of it. It's got a rich Māori history with a number of Te Tai Ihu iwi that have been there and are still continuing today. The area that we bought was about 225 hectares, and it's sort of broken up into 3 blocks. And today my immediate family, my parents, my sister and my brother and we own the bit that's in the blue here, and that's about 80 hectares. And one of the interesting things about this site is it is truly a 4-wheel drive site. So you can't drive an SUV there. You actually need a 4-wheel drive that can get down very steep clay roads that we maintain, and also around a tidal estuary that we only have access every couple of hours, to about 2 hours either side of low tide. There is some boat access there from Okiwi Bay, but it's pretty weather dependent, and this is a very open beach. So this is the place that we bought about 40 years ago. So this is what it looked like. So it was pretty bare. The previous owner ran it as a farm, and they burnt it quite a lot, and so there was lots of pasture. So the little picture of the batch there, that batch is still there. It's a real Kiwi batch, and that's a picture of me as a baby. So they bought it when I was a baby. So I've grown up with this place all my life, and so you can see in the background lots of sort of scrubby, but lots of pasture. And the main big photo here is of Clockput Hill, and that's the area that my immediate family still own today. So this is what it looked like 40 years ago. And then this is some more pictures of the early days. You can see one of the access track there coming in above the people there. They mainly bought it as a recreational place, so for fishing and hunting, but also as to run sheep on as well. So you can see what it looked like. Here's some pictures. I think it's the second year that they had owned it. My family had owned it, and you can see they'd just burnt it. That was what the previous owner did. They didn't burn, my father and my uncle didn't burn everywhere, but you can see here on the big picture here, there was little bits of remnants that still existed. And in some of those little pockets, like this one in particular, was protected enough so things like native brooms still existed in there. So there's little bits of bush everywhere, but Dad and my uncle, who owned it together, burning wasn't really for them. So in the sort of mid-80s, they sort of thought about that, and they decided they didn't want to burn. They considered putting it into pines, but they decided because of its site and some of the advice they had that wasn't going to work. So they looked at basically letting it go, so letting it see if it will regenerate back into bush. And so my main memories actually as a kid is gorse on the hills and golden gorse in the summer, so much so that if my dad and the friends that were down there were going hunting in the morning, that wasn't for me. If it was fishing, I got up, otherwise I stayed in bed. So slowly the whole area turned into gorse, predominantly, and there was very little tree cover in places. So the main access road in, my mother remembers walking the dogs and stuff up there. There's only a couple of places high up where those gullies are, where there was some shade during the hot summer, and that persisted until in the 2000s. But slowly through the late 90s and the early 2000s, more and more native kava came up. So particularly Kānuka and Mānuka, and in some of the wetter and sort of shadier areas, there was mahoi and wariwood and some tree ferns that came through. And so as the Mānuka and Kānuka in particular came up through the gorse and started to flower, we started getting bellbirds coming in. So definitely the whole thing changed. And even 10 years ago, there was still a lot of gorse. So there was, especially you can see in this photo from 2012, there's still quite a lot of gorse, particularly on the drier, steeper sites. But today it's very, very different. So even 10 years on from there, there's very, very little gorse. And so today we've got increasing diversity. We've got full tree canopy in most places, except for some very exposed steep spaces, particularly above the ocean. And now we've got all sorts of other secondary species coming through. We've got lots of mahoi, and there's lots of tree ferns and increasing diversity, and particularly there's also lots of little treasures coming up like tree needles and the nikau and cork tree fowl and the likes of that. So it's changed a lot. It now feels like a forest. And so about 10 years ago, my parents and my uncle, who owned the farm elsewhere and here and jointly owned, they split them up a bit more. And so my family, my brother, my sister, their families, and my parents, we sort of took ownership of about 80 hectares on the eastern side, and we built a lodge for us, and we started building tracks through the forest for access. And that's also about the time when the next generation came along. So we've got about there's 6 grandchildren now that come here and have grown up like I do, visiting this really special spot. So the ETS. So when my parents made the decision about basically letting it regenerate, there was no ETS. There wasn't even talk really much about carbon farming. So people who know me know that I'm not a big fan of the ETS because of its complexity, and I think at the moment it's not really incentivizing the kind of outcomes that I think we need. So we, out of that 80 hectares, you can see here in the pink, about 44 hectares was in that block, was counted into the ETS, and that was where our consultant and MPI decided the line was between pre and post 1990. We think it's probably underestimated on this side, and in my uncle's land was probably overestimated. But anyway, so that's some of the details you end up doing, and I think Sean sort of talked about that, about where those lines are. We had a start date, retrospective start date about 1995, and in the last counting, the ETS counting, we had about, for over 35 years, about 3,200 units. So at that time, the carbon price was pretty low, so that works out about 1,500 per hectare. And now at the price that's gone up, it's now closer to around 5,500 per hectare. So for us, we're in a situation where we didn't need an income from that land because we had farm elsewhere. We could let that regenerate. So now we're at the point where we could use some of that land for more management and stuff, but it's definitely from front footing it's a different sort of, yeah. So anyway, some of the challenges with the ETS is that from a user perspective, we have a consultant that helps us navigate the system. But even, you've got going into the website, it's very jargon rich, it's quite complex. So it is kind of hard to navigate. And as an example of it does take time too for changes, and we still haven't separated the two carbon, the ETS from my uncle's land and my family's land in here. And we started that process many years ago. So there is some challenges there as well. And because of that, we haven't used any of those units at the moment. They're all just sitting there. So we're also have family land in Upper Moutere, and we've been heavily involved in the Moutere catchment and been planting a lot. So we've sort of been learning a lot about how much work it takes to plant, also how satisfying it is, and amazing to be able to plant up riparian blocks. So some of my thoughts on how we'd go about with ETS is, I think you definitely do need to get advice and do your homework, as Sean was talking about some of those things. And the ETS has changed a lot, and it is likely to continue to change quite a lot more. I think there's some good things that is happening, but there is uncertainty there. I think we need to bear that in mind. It is hard to navigate even with a consultant, and I think for us, we're in a very privileged position that now we could use some of that money that's coming from the ETS to do better management, and because we could wait for an income, but that's not really what a lot of us want to do, especially in places like in the Moutere. I'd like to do a lot more planting and put on wetland projects. So we're going to have to work out how we're going to make that work. I think, and Sean kind of talked about it at the moment, how you don't get a lot of carbon credits for natives, and hopefully that is going to change. There's different organisations that have looked at that, so that might become better. There might be a more high return in the future. And the other thing I think we should keep an eye on, and I think yes, is He Waka Noa, because for those areas that are below the ETS cutoff, like less than 1 hectare and less 30 metres wide, there is provision in there that there might be able to get some help from there, and also the pest and weed management of existing bush, which I think is a good idea to look out for. So quickly for us, going forward, we need to be more active there. So now that we've got a forestry, we've got a canopy, we've got different challenges. There's always been, pigs, which is one of the draw cards for my parents to buy the place. But we do big culls and then they come back because there's a huge land area behind us and they do a lot of damage. And so this is one area earlier that we walked in earlier this year, and they've just completely decimated the undergrowth. And that's also leading to erosion and that sort of thing. So we need to come up with a better plan to tackle the goats and possums. And also we're seeing cats come in as well. We have tackled the wildling pines on our block, but there's a lot on the surrounding blocks that we'd like to help get rid of, and we have to keep an eye on. And old man's beds now are becoming quite a big issue. So I think for our family, we'll be looking at how we could use some of the ETS money to help us better manage the land and also increase the biodiversity and continue the succession on the forest, because I think that succession is at risk now with all this pest damage. So here's a picture of basically the change that we've had for 40 years. It's quite a big change. It's amazing now that the forest it's amazing. I love trees. I've always loved trees, and my mum and I are always trying to find new species that are coming up that we haven't seen before.